In modern music, we mostly deal with four clefs, and they are the treble clef, the bass clef, the alto clef, and the tenor clef. The clef that viola players use is officially called the alto clef, but we also call it the viola clef because it is so linked to that instrument, and that's what I'm going to call it for the rest of this video. When you look at music written for the viola going back several centuries, most of the time the range is about 2 octaves. First of all, you want to know that the lowest note on viola is always the C below middle C. That's important. So let's take a look at what that music would look like using the modern treble clef. You can immediately see that the lower range is very hard to read. There are too many ledger lines. Remember that old composers didn't like writing ledger lines because it took so long. Remember also that these ledger lines were very hard to line up, so they were very hard to read. If we use the Goldilocks analogy, we can say that this clef goes too low. If we write the same range in bass clef, now the lower octave looks quite good. But once again, we have the ledger line problem, this time in the upper range. Again, using the Goldilocks analogy, this clef goes too high. But when we write this range in viola clef, it looks just about perfect. So Goldilocks would say, this clef is just right. And that's why old composers preferred this clef. The problem for pianists is that everything looks wrong in viola clef. Pianists are used to reading treble clef and bass clef, so for us, every letter seems to be wrong and it is extremely confusing. Supposing we write this range again in bass clef, but this time we write it all 1 octave lower. It turns out that I am really showing you an unusual clef that looks just like bass clef, but it has a tiny 8 on top. That tiny 8 tells us to play everything an octave higher than the normal bass clef. So all of a sudden, we have a perfect system for pianists. I use this system myself for a translation. I am fully aware that this clef is unnecessary for violists. Now comes the rabbit hole. I find this rabbit hole extremely fascinating, and I spent a couple of days carefully investigating it. What about modern music for viola? Well, it turns out that today's viola range is at least 3 octaves and more like 4 octaves. And that's because most of the 4th octave is possible. So let's write all of this wider range in the treble clef. The bottom note will not change, but modern music goes up way, way higher. In this example, the lower range looks awful, but the next 3 octaves look great. What happens if we put the whole range in bass clef? Well, we can immediately see this looks terrible. So finally, let's find out what we get if the whole range has to be written in viola clef. Once again, we see that the bottom 2 octaves look great, although there is the same problem for pianists of having to translate all the letters. But we can also see that the top range is unusable. So now we know something very important. We're going to need 2 different clefs for viola music. We need the viola clef for the bottom 2 octaves and the treble clef for the 3rd and 4th octaves. If we find that the 4th octave is too difficult to read, we can use an octave sign for those high notes. When to use the octave sign is completely up to the notator to decide what is clearest to read. Well, what about for pianists? It turns out that for us, it's much better to think only in bass clef and treble clef. This way we can put the bottom octave in bass clef, and then we can put everything else in the treble clef. Once again, if you find that the 4th octave is too difficult to read, we can use the octave sign for those high notes. For instance, if I want to write something for viola, I will do it this way first because it is very easy to hear it in my mind this way. Then once I am sure it is correct, I can simply flip that bass clef to the viola clef. When we eliminate the viola clef, there is no need for pianists to mentally change letters. I need to translate music with this method to keep myself from getting lost in what I call a musical tower of Babel. I realize that these mental gymnastics are totally unnecessary for violists, but I suspect other pianists have to do something like what I do in order to be able to process the music. Please don't forget to subscribe to my channel. Leave me comments about anything you like, comments about anything you want to see in the future, and remember that I consider all suggestions.